A door left open. That winter had been unrelenting, a brutal, merciless season that had draped the rugged terrain in a heavy, suffocating blanket of white. The snow had been falling since well before sunset, and this was nothing like the soft, romantic flakes you'd find in a fireside tale. This was the kind of snow that erased roads entirely and smoothed the world into something far quieter and far more treacherous. It was the sort of snowfall that swallowed landmarks whole and muffled every sound, leaving behind nothing but the lonely wail of the wind and the bone-deep frozen silence of the Wild West. And it was deep within that vast white stillness that My Lin, a 22-year-old Chinese woman, stood barefoot at the tree line, her traditional dark-colored cheongsam, a sharp, striking contrast against the relentless snow, its fabric now rigid and glazed with frost. A vivid red scarf was wound snugly around her neck, the only burst of color in an otherwise colorless world, a delicate flag of defiance against the storm. With every breath, small, fragile clouds drifted from her lips, each one a reminder that life still burned somewhere inside her. She had been walking for what felt like forever, until the boundary between fear and cold dissolved and became one single, gnawing ache deep in her stomach. The world had collapsed into a dizzying, endless expanse of white, and the faint glow of a solitary cabin, once a beacon she had clung to, now bled and blurred through the swirling storm like a promise she wasn't sure she could afford to trust. Hope was a dangerous thing to spend in this land, and she had learned to be careful with it. But survival didn't wait for caution. It was a primal, urgent force that pushed her forward, one agonizing step at a time, through the ever-deepening snow. When she finally reached the rough-hewn wooden door of the cabin, her hands were trembling so violently she could barely curl her fingers into a fist to knock. The wood was cold and unforgiving beneath her frozen knuckles. She whispered words that felt smaller than her shame, a desperate plea swallowed almost instantly by the wind. "May I sleep in your cabin, sir? It's freezing out here." She had no way of knowing whether mercy lived behind that door, or something far colder, something that would only mirror the biting frost already eating into her bones. The door groaned open to reveal Ronan, a lone rancher of 30, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame filling the entire doorway. A light dusting of snow clung to his coat, evidence of his own recent battle with the storm, and his eyes, the pale gray blue of a winter sky, held the weary, guarded watchfulness of a man who had come to expect disappointment, and far too often, cruelty from the world. He took his time looking her over, his gaze settling on the frost-bitten fingers clutching her worn bundle, on the way she held herself ramrod straight with quiet, unbroken dignity, even while shaking violently. Here was a spirit the relentless cold had not yet managed to crush. For a long, wordless moment, he said absolutely nothing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire somewhere behind him, and the mournful, hungry howl of the wind at her back. And then something in Ronan's chest, a place he had long assumed was frozen solid, tightened. Without a word, he stepped aside and pushed the door wider. It was a simple, unremarkable gesture, yet out here in the desolate wilderness, it spoke volumes. Because in a place like this, kindness never came without a cost, and he knew it. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and strong coffee grounds, the rich, layered scent of a life being lived, of warmth that was almost overwhelming to My Lin's senses. She lingered just past the threshold, hesitant, as if the warmth itself might accuse her of something, of being a burden, of intruding where she had no right to be. Her dark, expressive eyes were lowered, her shoulders braced for the refusal she still half expected, even after the heavy door had swung shut behind her, sealing out the storm. Ronan, a man of very few words, placed another thick log into the stone fireplace. The flames surged as if startled by the unexpected company, sending dancing shadows rippling across the rustic room. He offered her a thick woolen blanket, not handing it directly to her, but setting it carefully on a nearby stool, a quiet acknowledgement of the invisible distances that strangers in this untamed land held sacred between them. She accepted it with a slight bow of her head and settled close to the hearth. The rough warmth was a welcome kindness against her frozen skin. She began to thaw gradually, feeling returning to her numb fingers and toes in slow, painful waves of pins and needles. In the dancing firelight, she was acutely aware of how fragile this safety was. Like a thin sheet of ice, a temporary refuge in a world that had shown her precious little mercy. As the snow thickened against the small window panes and piled into ever deeper drifts outside, both of them, the solitary rancher and the freezing stranger, found themselves quietly wondering how long this fragile peace, this unspoken truce against the storm, could possibly hold. By morning, the storm had not eased. If anything, it had grown fiercer, sealing the cabin inside a world of absolute white. The town, a small, tight-knit community a few miles away, had already taken notice of Ronan's unexpected guest. In places where gossip was practically a pastime and judgment flowed as freely as water, word traveled faster than even the most sure-footed horse. By the time Ronan rode into town to gather supplies, his horse laboring through the deep drifts, the sheriff's eyes were already sharpened with a familiar, unwelcome suspicion. Sheriff Thompson, a man whose sense of authority was as unyielding as the frozen ground, leaned against the weathered post outside the general store. His posture was almost casual, but his gaze was anything but. He spoke softly, and that quiet tone was always more menacing than a shout. He told Ronan plainly, in no uncertain terms, that the Chinese woman didn't belong there, that trouble followed her kind around like a shadow, and that the town would be a calmer, more orderly place once she was gone. Ronan listened without offering a single argument, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. He understood that in a town like this, silence could be its own quiet form of resistance. Yet a growing, unsettled feeling gnawed at him, a question of how much longer that silence could hold against the rising tide of prejudice that surrounded them both. My Lin could feel the town's cold even from the relative safety of the cabin. It was something you could almost reach out and touch, a chill that had nothing at all to do with the winter. When she walked down to the nearby creek to wash, moving with her usual graceful deliberateness, nearby conversations would cut off abruptly, replaced by hostile stares and whispered comments she could feel landing against her back like small, sharp stones. When she passed the small, white-steepled church on the edge of the settlement, eyes followed her from behind curtained windows, every glance a silent indictment. Each time, she returned to the cabin with her back straight and her head high, refusing to let any of them see the trembling in her hands. She would sweep the freshly fallen snow from the cabin steps with quiet determination, prepare simple but nourishing meals from whatever little was on hand, her hands moving with an efficiency that came from a life well acquainted with hardship. She refused to look like someone who had to beg for the simple right to exist. In the evenings, after the sparse supper was cleared away, she would settle by the fire, the flickering light catching the intricate embroidery on her cheongsam, and mend Ronan's worn coat with careful, precise stitches. He would pretend not to watch the way her hands moved with such practiced grace, so unlike his own rough, work-hardened fingers. Both of them were keenly aware that the physical closeness forced by the small cabin was becoming something more, something considerably more dangerous than the storm raging outside. It was a delicate intimacy, woven from shared silence and unspoken understanding. One evening, after another fierce storm had sealed the world beyond the cabin into a profound and absolute hush, Ronan left a carefully wrapped bundle on the edge of the simple cot that served as My Lin's bed. Inside, she found a thick wool dress the color of a stormy sea, a pair of soft leather gloves, and a warm, hand-knitted scarf. The items still carried the faint, familiar scent of the general store, and something subtler beneath it, the quiet evidence of his deliberate, careful choosing. He turned away without a word as she unwrapped them, as though he was afraid that gratitude, spoken out loud, might embarrass them both, might shatter the delicate balance they had worked so hard to build. My Lin reached for the soft fabric with trembling fingers, touching the dress as though it might dissolve beneath her hands like a dream she was terrified of waking from. A feeling she had no name for, warm and aching all at once, tightened in her chest. Later that same evening, she brewed a pot of strong coffee and carried a steaming cup to him, where he sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the firelight glinting off the polished steel. She offered it with a shy, luminous smile that warmed him far more deeply than the crackling fire ever could, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, crinkling their corners and, just for a moment, erasing the weariness that so often shadowed her face. For the first time, they sat together on the hearth, their knees nearly touching, sharing the quiet in a way that felt intimate rather than empty. It was a silence that invited wonder instead of fear, a comfortable, unhurried companionship that neither of them had thought to find. Outside, the snow continued to pile higher and higher, slowly and relentlessly erasing the world they had each known, and within the small, warm shelter of the cabin, a new one was quietly beginning to take shape. It was on one of those long, endless nights, the wind singing its lonely song outside, that Ronan, with an almost boyish uncertainty that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, cleared a small space on the rough-planked floor near the table and asked, his voice low and tentative, if she would like to dance. There was no music, only the crackling of the fire and the rhythm of their own breathing. His heavy boots were clumsy against the floor, his steps uncertain, a sharp contrast to the confident, sure way he moved through the world outside. My Lin laughed softly, a sound so surprised and achingly beautiful that it seemed as though joy itself had forgotten her for a long, sorrowful while and had only just now remembered. She moved lightly, gracefully, in spite of the invisible weight she carried. And when he spun her just a little too fast and they nearly stumbled, he caught her at the waist, the touch both instinctive and gentle, his large hands careful against the fabric of her dress. Time seemed to still as they stood there, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath, her gaze lifting slowly to meet his, a silent question shimmering in its dark depths. Though they stepped apart a moment later, the space between them charged with something unspoken. Both of them knew that something tender and irreversible had just been said, without a single word. The town's thin patience, already worn ragged by suspicion and prejudice, finally snapped the day a theft was discovered. A set of valuable tools, essential for surviving the brutal winter, had gone missing from a neighbor's shed, and suspicion, like a hungry wolf, leapt eagerly toward My Lin, as though it had been lying in wait for exactly this kind of opportunity. Sheriff Thompson came to the cabin this time with a group of grim-faced men at his back, their voices low but edged with accusation, telling Ronan to send her away before things got worse, before the town decided to handle matters themselves. My Lin stood quietly to one side, her face a composed and tranquil mask that somehow made the injustice of it all even sharper. She had already begun folding her few meager belongings with deliberate, resigned movements. And when Ronan, his voice steady and unshakable, told them that she would remain until the truth came to light, the sheriff's smile in return was thin and full of warning. That night, in the deep, cold hours before dawn could soften the darkness, My Lin tried to leave. She slipped from her cot with her small bundle held tight to her chest, convinced that love, the fragile, budding emotion she felt for the quiet rancher, meant making herself smaller. It meant disappearing so that others could breathe a little easier. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but it was nothing compared to the sharp, hollow ache in her heart. That old, familiar instinct telling her that staying had always been, and would always be, the most dangerous choice a woman like her could make. Ronan caught her at the door, an icy draft swirling around them both. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with a raw, barely contained emotion, as he asked her why she thought vanishing was the only way to keep the peace, as though the very idea of her leaving wounded something deep inside him. She answered without tears, because she had learned long ago how to survive without them. She told him, her voice quiet but steady, that the world had shown her time and time again what happened to women like her when they stayed where they weren't wanted. The plain, unadorned truth of her words settled heavily between them, sharper than any accusation. Something inside Ronan, a wall he had spent years carefully building around his heart, cracked open in that moment. He took her hands then, his touch surprisingly gentle, as though he feared she might dissolve into the swirling snow if he held on too tightly. He made her a promise, not with a raised voice or a hollow, grand vow, but with a quiet, unwavering resolve she could feel through his hands. He would stand up for her, he told her. He would find the truth, even if it cost him the town's respect, even if it cost him everything he had managed to build for himself in this lonely corner of the world. He didn't fight with raised fists or loud, angry demands. He fought with a patient, quiet persistence that simply refused to bend. He listened where others were quick to accuse. He watched where others had long since turned away in judgment. He spent days asking measured questions, observing the subtle shifts in the town's mood, until the truth, as it so often does, finally stepped out into the clear, cold light of day. The real thief turned out to be a young farmhand, desperate to settle a gambling debt, who stood exposed at last. Shame flooding his face as the cover of the town's collective prejudice slipped away, leaving him small and unmistakably human. Sheriff Thompson had very little to say when the truth surfaced. His silence was heavier and more damning than any apology could ever hope to be. The town's eyes, once so full of accusation, now slid away from My Lin with something uneasy and shamefaced in them. They didn't quite know how to face this woman who had carried the full weight of their cruelty with such quiet dignity, and still stood whole before them. As My Lin and Ronan walked back to the cabin together through the softly falling snow, their steps slow and close, she felt something deep within her begin to loosen. It was something she had been carrying for a very long time. Not just fear and sorrow, but the weight of an old, exhausting vigilance. What she felt wasn't triumph, and it wasn't the sharp, fleeting satisfaction of being proved right. It was something far more precious. A quiet, profound reclaiming of a dignity she had once believed the world had the power to take from her permanently. The snow drifted down onto her shoulders gently, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a soft, silent witness to her resilience. Love came quietly after that, as inevitably as spring follows winter. It slipped into their days the way fresh snow settles over a familiar landscape, soft and transformative, changing everything without ever asking permission or announcing itself. It lived in the way he started leaving a cup of hot tea by her bedside every morning, in the way she would hum a soft, unfamiliar melody as she cooked, a tune from a life he knew nothing about, but found himself longing to understand. One evening, by the fire, as the flames whispered low and shadows danced along the rough-hewn walls, Ronan finally said the words that had been quietly growing in his heart. His voice was low and unguarded, stripped of its usual gruffness. He wasn't offering a grand poetic declaration. He was offering a simple, unvarnished truth he could no longer carry alone. He told her that the cabin, once his solitary refuge, no longer felt like shelter unless she was in it. He confessed that every corner seemed to hold the echo of her warmth, even in silence, and that the thought of a life without her, a return to the lonely quiet that had once defined his entire existence, felt colder and more desolate than any winter he had ever endured. My Lin didn't answer with words. She simply leaned into him, a quiet, eloquent response, resting her head against his broad shoulder, her fingers finding his as naturally as if they had always belonged there. And in that gentle, unspoken closeness, he felt something he hadn't expected, the deep, breathtaking feeling of being truly seen, of being understood in a way that stole the breath from his lungs and settled a profound peace somewhere in his soul. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. The wind quieted its long, mournful howl, and the snow fell more softly, as though the world itself had paused, just for a moment, to bear witness to a love that had finally found the courage to stay. Their wedding came in the very heart of that same winter, a simple, unhurried ceremony held beneath a pale, hushed sky, as fat, unhurried snowflakes drifted down around them like tender, wordless blessings meant just for them. My Lin wore the modest wool dress Ronan had chosen for her, its deep blue fabric moving softly in the gentle wind. Her long dark hair had been braided with loving care, each intricate strand a quiet testament to the long and difficult road she had walked to arrive here, whole, and loved, and known. Ronan stood beside her, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he removed his worn hat, his eyes never once leaving her face, as though the entire snow-covered world had narrowed down to this single, fragile, perfect moment. They spoke their vows without grandeur or poetic flourish, just simple, heartfelt devotion. They promised to be shelter for one another when life's storms returned, to choose each other again and again when the world turned cruel or cold, to walk forward hand in hand even when the path ahead vanished beneath the snow. When they kissed, it was slow and reverent, a kiss filled with the quiet knowledge of everything they had endured together and everything they were still promising to protect. It was the kind of kiss shared only by two souls who had already survived the worst, and who knew, with an unshakable, bone-deep certainty, that they always would. Married life unfolded not in sweeping gestures, but in 1,000 small, luminous moments that felt almost sacred in their simplicity. There were quiet mornings when they shared coffee from the same warm cup, their hands brushing as pale winter light spilled through the frosted window panes. Ronan would often reach out and touch her fingers with his own, as if to reassure himself she was real, that the day wouldn't somehow take her from him. The evenings found them cooking side by side in the small, warm kitchen, her laughter soft and bright and ringing through the cabin when a dusting of flour landed on his coat. He would pull her close then, burying his face in her hair, just to breathe her in, as though joy were a fleeting thing that might fade if he didn't hold it close. They danced by the fire often now, no longer clumsy or hesitant, but slow and unhurried, his forehead resting gently against hers, every step feeling less like practice and more like a quiet, ongoing promise that this warmth, this love, was real and freely chosen. On the coldest nights, when the world outside was frozen and utterly still, they would wrap themselves in a shared blanket and sit together on the porch, watching the snow drift down in peaceful, endless silence. My Lin's head would rest on his shoulder while Ronan traced slow, lazy circles on her palm, neither of them needing words to say what they both already knew. They were safe. They were home. Sometimes, in a soft whisper nearly carried away by the wind, she would tell him that she had never imagined a life could be this gentle, this kind, and he would answer, not with words, but by pressing a kiss into her hair, filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to hold. The town watched them from a distance. The initial hostility faded slowly, giving way first to grudging respect, and then to a quiet, uncertain kind of transformation, as though the townspeople were learning, through the simple and undeniable evidence of Ronan and My Lin's life together, that love, when tended with patience and grace, had the power to soften even the harshest of winters and the most hardened of hearts. Years later, when the snow still fell without asking permission, and the warm, steady light of the cabin still burned like a beacon against the darkness, their story lived on in the memory of the town. It wasn't a story of gunfire or glory, of heroes or villains. It was a story about the simple, profound act of a single door being opened on a freezing night, and a choice made with a trembling hand and a fearless heart. It lived on in the quiet, everyday things, in the way the light in that cabin window never went out, no matter how fierce the winter storm, in the way two shadows could always be seen moving together behind the frosted glass, in the way laughter, clear, genuine, and true, would sometimes drift out into the snow like a blessing, offered freely to anyone who happened to be near enough to hear it.